previous video, I have covered AngularJS controllers. As part of that video, to make things easier to understand, I made up some fictitious explanations. In this video, we are going to cover AngularJS scope and how it is really related to controllers, and in fact, how controllers are created behind the scenes. Let's jump straight into the presentation. As part of this video, all we are going to cover is the scope related to AngularJS, but not really a scope related to JavaScript. So JavaScript scope is completely different, and in fact most of that particular explanation of the scope of JavaScript is also going to be included as part of scope in AngularJS. However, the concentration here in this video will be very much on the scope of AngularJS. So imagine I have a markup something like this. So the first script tag here, which actually imports AngularJS JavaScript library itself, and next we are writing our own script, and then you can see I have a particular module which is going to be created and instantiated. So which means as part of this statement, what I'm trying to do is create a module with a name called sample, instantiate it, and that particular module will be made available as part of this variable called sample. So sample is a module, and in fact it has been already instantiated by this particular statement. The next statement is we are trying to actually create the definition of the controller called EMP. So you can say I'm using the same module, that is sample.controller, which actually tries to create a controller in this case, and that particular controller, you can see I'm providing the name as EMP. So this is the definition. Whatever you are going to provide as part of this function is nothing but the definition of the controller. As I mentioned earlier, you can just consider this particular statement as defining a class called EMP, where the structure of that particular class is nothing but this function. So as part of this statement, you are creating the definition of the controller, but not the instance of the controller. So that definition will be still made available as part of your module, whatever you might have already created. So in this case, the module sample is currently having one definition of the controller called EMP, and the controller is not instantiated yet. Next, this is the most important part for which we need to concentrate for the rest of the video. So this is a particular simple element which has got ng controller, and you can see I'm just providing the name of the controller. In my previous video, if you remember, I have provided the controller name as O. I'm not providing as O here at the moment, and we are going to see what happens with the as O later, but for now imagine in this case I'm just doing a particular div tag with an ng controller directive and saying that this whole block of DOM should be closely working with the controller called EMP. Okay, what really happens once it tries to parse or compile this particular block? So what it really happens at the moment? First of all, it tries to create a particular context or say boundary. So in this case, you can see it is just nothing but a boundary or context which will be stored in some memory. So when I say memory, it is obviously the browser's memory anyway. So in this case, behind the scenes, you are not going to see this. However, it actually creates a memory area for that particular block which has been decorated with ng controller. So the moment Angular sees a particular DOM block decorated with ng controller, it actually creates some memory area, and it will have its own boundary where it will not expose any of that particular data to outside world, and that particular boundary along with the memory area, we can temporarily call that one as context. So which means it creates a context variable which really works only with that block for which the decoration has been made with ng controller directive. Okay, and that particular context can have some data. So which means I can have something like name equal to Jag or salary equal to 3,400 and so on. I can have most of the data to be associated with that particular context, and again this context will not be shown to the user, and it will always be residing in memory. So it is a logical context which will be created the moment AngularJS finds that particular ng controller related block. So this particular context can have data in the form of JSON, or it can also have other methods if really necessary. And where does this particular block really gets associated with this one? It is pretty simple. First of all, this particular block or this particular context really sits at DOM, in the DOM memory, and it is attached straight to that particular element. So which means this particular div element is having a direct access to this particular context. So this particular context or the memory area, even though it is available in browser's memory, it really sits at the DOM level and it is finally attached to that particular block element. So which means this div element has direct access to this particular data which is available as part of the context, and the context sitting in memory area. And what do we call this context? It is nothing but the scope. So this is the most important concept. So scope is nothing but the context. That particular context or scope really sits in the memory, which is directly associated to the respective element which is decorated with ng controller, and this entire scope is hidden from user interface. So this is which will be stored in memory, but it will never be shown to the user. However, this particular div element can have direct access to this particular scope object which sits in memory. So hopefully that clears what exactly is scope. However, how is this scope related to our controller, or this particular controller, how we are working with the scope? So we already mentioned like this particular scope and the controller and this particular div element, all of them have some kind of relation. How are we getting this data? As I mentioned, that particular controller will be actually sending the model out of it, and that will be the model which will be bound to the view. In this case, div is the view. The model is whatever the information we have inside the scope, and the controller has to update this particular model in order to update the element div. So how is the relation being maintained between scope and the controller? So let us see. When you mention EMP here, what you are saying is that create a new controller instance along with the scope being merged. So which means this particular controller instance, whatever it is going to create, will be actually instantiated as part of the module itself indirectly. So the module has got the definition of the controller. However, this controller is just the definition, it is not instantiated. And when is that instantiated? The controller EMP gets instantiated the moment AngularJS finds any directive, ng controller directive with the same name as of the controller. So the moment you provide the controller name here, and AngularJS, whenever it tries to compile this particular template, it actually creates an instance of this particular controller, and that particular controller is somehow having the relation to the scope. So somehow, whenever I say somehow, there is one more thing. The scope, whatever AngularJS creates in this context, is automatically merged into the controller instance. So even though you mention EMP and asking the module to create an instance, or say asking AngularJS to create an instance of the controller, AngularJS knows that it is not just the controller instance you are really asking for. Instead, you are asking for a controller instance which has a direct understanding about the scope and direct access to the scope itself. So in that way, what happens is that once you actually tries to create a controller instance, that particular instance, while it is being created, AngularJS actually creates a scope as well. So it creates both. So the moment it touches EMP, it creates both a controller instance and the scope. And both of those, so which means the same instance, the controller instance, while it is being created, this particular scope will also gets merged into that particular controller instance. So which means our controller instance will have direct access to this particular scope. And now you can see controller has direct access to scope, and our template, that is our view, is also having direct access to scope. So now you can say scope is like a glue between the template and the controller, or say between the view and the controller. So whenever I say glue, it is nothing but the mediator to transform your particular information or to actually exchange data between the view and the controller. If the controller needs to send any kind of information, like the controller instance, if it wants to send any information to the view, it sends through scope. Similarly, if the view wants to send information back to the controller instance, it sends through scope. So scope is the one which acts as the mediator between your controller instance and the view. So scope is being directly referred inside the controller instance, and the template or the view is also having direct instance to your particular scope. So once again, before we jump into the demo, I just wanted to clarify once again. You have, whenever AngularJS sees a particular template which is decorated with ngController directive, it finds the name of the controller, and whenever it starts finding the controller name, prior to that it creates the scope object and then the controller instance. And while creating the controller instance, it merges the scope object into the controller instance. So controller instance will have its own information of controller, and on top of that it also has direct scope merged inside itself. So when you are working with the controller instance, indirectly you can say that you are working with the scope, and scope is directly made available as part of the controller. So whenever the controller needs to send any information directly to the view, it cannot. It has to go only through the scope. Similarly, whenever the view wants to send in some information back to the controller instance, it cannot do it directly. Instead, it has to go through scope. So scope is the mediator between view and the controller. Controller sends the information to scope. Scope sends the information back to view. View sends the information to scope, and scope sends the information back to the controller instance. Controller instance will have the direct access to scope object. So hopefully that clears our understanding about the scope. And next, now you can see I am specifying name here. So you can see this is an Angular expression. So whenever I am specifying Angular expression, something like name, you are saying that please evaluate this variable name. So AngularJS, whenever it finds any kind of Angular expressions which need to be evaluated, that particular expression will be evaluated based on the current scope it is really having access to. So in this case, ngController has got direct access to scope, and as it has got that particular scope access, it tries to evaluate name which will be made available as part of the scope. That is what it is understanding. If the name itself is available in the form of a property inside the scope, the value will be automatically retrieved and will be placed here. If that particular evaluation expression is not available, which means in this case if you provide something like hire date or joining date which is not available inside the scope, AngularJS will not return any error. It just simply skips it. So that is pretty important. So if your particular evaluation expression related properties are not available in the scope, AngularJS may not really give you any kind of error or undefined. It just simply proceeds as if it can't do or it can't help. So that is pretty important. So if there is a mistake here, it may not really throw up any kind of error. So where are we getting this information from? As I mentioned, this scope acts as the data funding element for all of those expression evaluations and the data binding. So if you have any kind of data binding related stuff inside your particular view, all those data binding related expressions, including the evaluation of expressions, everything will be done within the context of the scope. So all of those particular expressions will try to fetch the data directly from the scope. If the scope doesn't have that data, it simply skips it. If it has it, those values will be directly replaced as part of the evaluation. So as I mentioned, controller instance will be sending the data to the scope, and the scope can send to the view based on the data binding and the evaluation of expressions you have in place. Okay, now that we understood something about scope, how do we use our scope inside the controller? In my previous slide, you can say I mentioned about scope, I mentioned about controller instance and so on, but I did not really explain on how you are going to access the scope inside the controller. I mentioned that you can access it, but I did not mention on how the controller can really access scope. So my next slide, which actually says how to access scope inside the controller and how to work with scope inside a controller. And this is a new markup. Now you can see I have the same thing here, except that I have some funny variable called $scope, and I have a $scope here. So as part of my previous slide, you can see I mentioned something like we are going to have scope which is directly associated to the respective view, and that particular scope is being directly referred in your controller using this particular variable called $scope. So which means whatever the memory area or whatever the scope which has been directly made available for this particular view can be directly accessible in your controller with a variable called $scope. So when you say $scope, you are essentially referring to this particular context. And once you have that as a variable as parameter here, you can start providing all the data to that scope in this way. So the moment you provide in this way now, which means you are adding a property called name and you are assigning a value called jag to that name, that actually says that to the scope which is available and glued to this particular element, please add a property called name. So whenever you do that, that particular data gets stored inside the scope in this way. Now scope has a particular property called name with a value called jag. In that way you can add as many properties as you want, including the methods if you really want to. And all that information will be automatically made available as part of scope. So in simple words, you can always access scope of a particular controller directly inside the controller instance using the built-in called $scope. So all you have to say is $scope dot and add as many properties as possible with all the necessary values, and all of those will be directly made accessible to our view. And now you can see my particular view is actually getting the data of this particular property name from the scope. And this is exactly what I was talking about. Controller using the scope sends the data directly to the scope, and once that particular data is made available to the scope, you can use views to actually bind or evaluate your expressions using the scope's context. And this is pretty much is the scope in Angular. And we are going to have more in-depth videos on how Angular scope is going to work. But for now, let us jump into demonstration. So as part of this demonstration, what I'm going to cover is how to work with the $scope in controller, how to access scope in console as part of developer tools for debugging or testing, and what are all the other best practices you can have as part of the scope itself. So let us jump straight into my editor here. So let me grab something from my previous example. I just wanted to have this whole thing. So I just say copy this whole thing into a new file. Just wanted to save this new file as 02.htm. And let me start a new controller definition, and let me start new div. So as of now all I have really is just the AngularJS which has been imported, just creating a module, and I have the body with ng app as my directive. So as part of my particular example, as I mentioned, I really wanted to create a controller. So in this case I can just say app.controller, and I can provide a controller name, which is emp in my case, and a function, and this is going to be my definition of that particular controller. So this is the function which says the controller's template, or you can say the definition or the structure of the controller will be made available as part of the function. This is just similar to a constructor function in general. And now, as part of this particular function, as I mentioned, I really wanted to have the scope to be used. So I'm going to say $scope, and I can also say like $scope dot, I would like to add a new property called name, and the value is going to be jag right there. So let me improve my script a bit. Okay, so I'm having the controller, and the name of the controller is emp, and I'm using scope, so which means my controller is going to have the scope to be used, and that particular scope, for that object I'm adding a property called name, and I'm placing a value jag inside that particular scope's property. And I'm going to have div. So as part of my div, so this is going to be my view, and I'm going to use the directive ng controller, and the name of the controller, in this case it is emp. So this is pretty important. In my previous video, when I was discussing just about the controllers, I'm actually using emp as O, and I'm not going to use that here anymore, for which I'm going to explain what happens if we use emp as O bit more later. So for now, let us consider I'm using ng controller with just the name of the controller, which essentially, even though you do not write as O as in previous example, even though if you don't write this particular thing essentially creates a new instance of the controller, as I explained in my presentation. And now all I am going to use is hello with that particular AngularJS expression which needs to be evaluated against the scope. So this property, whenever AngularJS tries to evaluate it, it tries to find the scope object which has been associated to this view, and in this case it tries to find the scope based on this particular controller. So it tries to create the controller based on the same scope associated, and that particular scope, as long as the controller accesses it, and you can see controller sends that information and gets the scope initialized. So that is important. So as part of my previous example, as I mentioned, AngularJS creates scope object. Okay, let me go back. So AngularJS creates scope object, creates controller instance, merges the scope into the controller's instance, and then executes the code available inside the controller, which is nothing but scope.name. Now the scope gets initiated with those particular members called name or salary or whatever you are going to place, and scope gets ready. Once the scope gets ready, then all the evaluation of expressions will be actually performed. And back here you can see I'm following the same thing. So let me save this and see if this is working fine. So I'm already having my IIS Express running. So let me try to access 02.html using my browser. So in this case it is 02.html, and now you can see I have hello jag. So actually jag is actually coming from my scope. So if I put something like tag cbt here, and if I go back here and if I retrieve it, if I refresh it, you can see I got a different name here. So in that way you can place or modify your particular scope with any number of values or any number of properties, including collections and also the methods. Okay, let me move to a different example. So let me create a new example using the same thing. I just copy whole thing available here and use the same thing in 03. So I would like to use 03.html. So let me use Chrome instead of Firefox. Let me close this and let me minimize scope. Okay, so as part of this, we understood like we can use $scope, which is essentially nothing but you are referring to the scope in which the view is really having access to. We are fine in that way. But imagine you are minimizing the JavaScript, and imagine your particular script is actually made available as part of some other JavaScript file, something like your app.js, which essentially contains this whole script. And if you minimize that particular JavaScript file, the minimizer essentially may be modifying this to something like this one as C, or probably this whole thing as C. Why? Because the minimizers usually we'll try to find all the parameter names and provide as simple variables as possible, and those will be replaced in this way, c and c.name. So whenever you do something like that, that is not going to be understood by your AngularJS. So if you come back here, so imagine if I'm trying to access, which is 03.htm, you can see AngularJS could not understand that. Why? Because C means it is just a normal variable and it is not really working like as we did earlier, like $scope. So $scope is a reserved word as part of AngularJS. It is a service. But here you are not referring to $scope, as because once minimized, all those parameter variables, whatever you are specifying here, might be really modified in whatever the way it wants to be. So for that purpose, what AngularJS recommends is you better include your particular function in the form of a particular collection, and at the same time provide all those particular parameters right here. So whenever I provide something like this, so which means you are saying that you are having a function. However, make sure that this particular function's related first variable is actually going through $scope. So essentially, even though your particular JavaScript is minimized, this particular will not be modified because this is part of a string and it will never be modified by any of the JavaScript minimizers. And at runtime, AngularJS is smart enough that it has to replace this particular variable C with $scope. So in fact, this particular C will be replaced with $scope, and you are essentially using $scope here and here without really specifying $scope in an indirect way. So now let us save this one and try to retrieve this and refresh this. And now you can see now I got Jag here again. So that is pretty important. So this is a standard everyone is supposed to follow if your particular JavaScripts are going to be minimized, and most likely those are going to be minimized if you're developing a huge AngularJS application. So even though you find online any kind of example just like this, make sure that these are just samples or examples, but those are not really ready for production level production level code or standards. If your particular application or your particular JavaScript really needs to go into the production along with the minimizing and throwing to your browser, you should follow this particular syntax. So which means you have to provide all the values first, which will be replaced into the respective variables later, and you are going to use the same variables over the time. So that is one important thing I would like to express before even starting to jump to the next topic. Okay, so now we have seen two different ways. One is using the scope as part of your particular parameter. The next one is you're still using scope, however you are saying that it needs to be picked up from a particular variable kind of a deal. Usually this is called as a dependency injection, and that will be covered as part of our upcoming videos. So for now, just consider when you specify this, that is going to be replaced here and you are going to use that here, which is fine. So let us switch back to 02.htm and let me access 02.htm here. Okay, so which is fine. I still got hello Jag here. So let me open developer tools for a second. Okay, and now imagine I'm here, so which means I am available at div. And if you are not familiar with certain of the easier or tips to actually find the current element you have highlighted. So in this case you can say I have highlighted this guy. So in order to get that highlighted element in your particular console, all you have to do is $0. The moment you provide $0, you can see you are actually getting the currently highlighted element as part of your particular developer tools. Again, if I select body, for example, and again if I say $0 and press enter, you can see I'm actually getting body here. So this is a very convenient way to refer to currently highlighted element as part of your console. So let me clear again. So again, as I mentioned, you can just right click here and say inspect, which actually tries to highlight whatever the element you are trying to inspect here, and the moment it is available here, you can always access that by just providing $0. And the moment you provide it, you can see that you are able to access that element straight in your developer console using $0, which is fine. So let me clear everything. Okay, so now imagine I would like to access the scope object of this particular element div. As we know, div is our view, and you can see it has automatically added two classes called ngScope and ngBinding. If you come back to my particular script, I did not add any such attributes, and in fact I added only ngController. If you switch back to your particular console, you can see I have added ngController, which is in its place. However, AngularJS is adding two new classes automatically called ngScope and ngBinding. We are going to worry about these two later, but for now let us consider, like whenever you put ngController, AngularJS will automatically tries to add ngScope and ngBinding automatically by itself. That is most important thing you should really observe. Next thing is that AngularJS actually replaced my my evaluation expression with actually the value itself. As you know, it has been evaluated. So once evaluated, we are going to get the value automatically. So we got it. How do I access the scope of this particular view from our console? So the easiest way is, first of all, you have to get the element, and we know that $0 currently gives this currently highlighted element, and you have to say please get the element available at $0. So which means I am specifying $0, which is nothing but div, and I am sending that particular div element to angular.element method, which actually gives us the Angular representation of that particular element. So this particular view, whatever you have highlighted, is currently accessible to $0 through $0, and you are saying that please give the Angular version of that particular element. So in order to say that, I have to say angular.element, or say angular.element get $0, and you can provide any kind of jQuery element if you would like to provide here. For now I'm just specifying $0 because I have highlighted it. So I'm saying that please get the Angular version of this particular $0, which is nothing but div, and now I can say dot scope, and the moment I say that, AngularJS, as I mentioned, Angular version of $0 means it will have something like scope method, which essentially gives us all the things available. And now you can clearly see there exists a particular property called name, which is having a value called jag. That is important. So let me clear everything here, and let me modify the same value here. So imagine I would like to say something like techcbt.com, and if I go back here, I refresh this, and let me highlight this guy, and then again I am going to say Angular element of $0, which means nothing but get the Angular version of this particular development, and after that execute the scope function or scope method. The moment I say that, it is going to give me the scope object, which will have an ID, and you can see there is something called name, which is having techcbt.com. And imagine if you are adding one more property called salary, for example, and I save this, and I'm going to say hello name, something like Sal. So let me see how this is going to work. So I retrieve this, and now you can see it is actually giving both of those values. You can see how your particular DOM has been modified accordingly. I select this, and now you execute the same thing, Angular element, which means get the Angular version of your particular $0 element and find the scope of it. And once I find the scope of it, you are going to see those two properties automatically made available. So we have seen how to access your particular scope from your developer tools. There is Imagine from your particular console you would like to modify the value of salary from 4,500 to something like 5,400 or say 6,000, and you would like to have this one to be automatically modified right from the console. So which means I'm not going to modify here, but instead from the console I would like to just modify the salary and show that directly as part of your particular web page. So that is only for troubleshooting or debugging. So if such is the case, then I have to use Angular dot, and now you can see there are several things like okay, let me get to the element first. Angular dot element $0 dot scope, which means nothing but we are going to have the scope, and let us say dot sal and press enter, and you can see all you are saying is just getting the salary out of it. Similarly, I can also say something like name. We have that. And now imagine I would like to say scope dot salary equal to 6,000 for example, and press enter. And now again I go back to salary and see whether it is 6,000 or not. Yes, it is 6,000, but you can see the 6,000 is not replaced here. The easiest way to do that is $digest. Oh, okay, hold on. I had to say and the moment I say $digest on the scope, you can see I got 6,000. So similarly, imagine I'm actually saying 7,000. So which means you are modifying the salary inside the scope, but instead those particular values or that particular data, whatever you are providing as part of the scope, is not immediately propagated to your DOM yet. So you can see you're still seeing 6,000 here, but in fact you know that you modified to 7,000. In order to propagate the entire scope object back to your DOM, you need to call digest on the scope itself. That is important. So the moment I do that, now you can see it has modified your particular DOM to 7,000, which essentially made some modification to this guy as well. So this is something very advanced, which I am going to cover later in my upcoming videos, but this is just some kind of for your information. Like if you would like to modify scope at the console and propagate all the modifications of the scope to your DOM, you can do something like this. And there are more better ways instead of using $digest, for which I am going to cover in my upcoming videos, where we are going to cover what is watch, how we can have the digest cycle, digest loop, and all of those particular things. And for now, let us consider that our particular understanding of how Angular scope is really having Angular controller to be working with. Okay, so now that I have $scope, which can be made available at that particular function, we can also have certain methods. For example, okay, so I wanted to go through this route. I can use either this route or the other route. For our convenience, I am going through this one, but make sure that if you go to your production level code, you have to use something like this. And even in your production code, you might be seeing a lot of people will be just working in this way. So it does not harm you even if you go in this way. So once you minimize it, this might be automatically covered or converted to C or something like that, and still it works with no problems. So whenever you see something like this, it is nothing but instead of using A, they are using $scope, which is also considered as a variable. Essentially at runtime, this $scope variable is going to be replaced with $scope anyway, and finally you are still working with the same option. Okay, so let me quickly add $scope.salary equal to, in this case, 4,500, and I'm going to say looks like your salary is what I say, salary for now. And let me get, this is 03.html, and let me go to 03.html, and I have that particular salary automatically displayed. And imagine I would like to add a method to the scope, so I can also say scope.get annual salary equal to function, and inside this function I can say return this dot salary start 12. So which means I'm saying that this is a function which will be made available to the scope, and using the scope as this, so which means this directly refers to scope here, and I am saying that this dot salary, which is nothing but I am currently trying to access this variable here, multiplying by 12 returns the same value out of this expression, which gives the annual salary. And I can say your annual salary is, and I can say something like the same function name, just like salary you are using here. I can use get annual salary, which is actually a method. So you cannot use this one as a property. This is a property, but this is a method. So if it is a method, I have to actually use the parenthesis as because it needs to be executed. So let me go back to my browser, and the moment I say that, you can see I got your annual salary is something like 54,000 at the moment. And you can also have multiple controllers if you really want to work with. So for example, this is just a controller in EMP. Similarly, if I would like to have one more controller, I can say app.controller, and in this case let us consider I would like to call this one as customer info with what I say again $scope, so that is $scope, and then I am going to have the function with the $scope, and then I am going to have the definition of the function here, and as part of that I can say something like $scope.name equal to jag, and at the same time I can say $scope.city equal to Vienna. And this is another controller which has got no relation with our particular view here in this case. So I'm going to have one more div to be written here, and this particular div will have a directive with this particular customer info. So I'm going to use the same customer info here, and I have that particular customer info, and now I can say hello customer, and I would like to provide a name here which is essentially nothing but jag, and I'm going to say looks like you are living in Vienna. So instead of Vienna I have to use city as because that is my variable. So you can see I'm using city here and name right here. So even though you are using same name in the previous controller, this evaluation will be based on this scope as because you are working with EMP. However, this name will be actually working with this name because your controller is customer info, and this related scope is actually related to this guy. So I actually refresh this one, and now you can see this is hello customer jag, looks like you are living in Vienna. So in that way you can have multiple controllers as needed. So let me get back to my presentation, and let us focus on our next last part of this particular presentation, which is Angular scope being used in various syntaxes. This is pretty important as because it is the most confusion among AngularJS developers, like how the scope is being referred as part of controllers. So we already knew that we can use $scope in this way, so which means I just use the name of the controller right here. So EMP, that's the name of the controller, as something like here. And now I can directly use $scope, which is nothing but this particular EMP controller related scope is directly associated, and I can use all those particular all those particular properties to be pushed into the scope along with the values, and I can use the same scope for evaluation of expressions. This we have already seen. And this is what I used in my previous video when I was explaining the controller. In my previous video, I was explaining controller, and you can see I'm actually using ng-controller EMP, which is nothing but this guy, as wo. So what is this wo? In my previous video I explained O is actually an instance of controller, and then all those particular properties whatever you are going to assign to that controller instance will be made available to the view. That's what I said, but that is just only to get a quick understanding of how the controllers really work. But behind the scenes, this name and the controller along with O, everything works with the scope. So we need to understand how this particular concept of controller as something really works. So let us get back into my previous example. So in this way we'll have a better understanding. So let me take out what are all I don't really need. Okay, so this is my first example which is related to controllers. I am not mentioning anything about scope here. This is an example from my previous video. I am saying that controller EMP, and at the same time I am saying this, so which this means according to my previous video, this is actually controller. And I'm saying that as O, which means O is an instance of that particular controller, and I'm trying to access O.name. You can see in my current example I'm not using O.name, I'm just using name. You can see that. But in my previous example I mentioned O.name. Why? Because O being referred as the instance of controller. And let me execute this and see how this is being executed as part of AngularJS from developers tools point of view. So let me go to one.html, which is nothing but this particular example, and you can see I'm still having jag with the salary, and you can see I have jag with the salary, which is fine. And now you can still see I automatically got ng scope and ng binding. This is pretty important. Whether or not you are adding it, you can see even though you are just using the controllers, the scope is being added, and it has also got other classes necessary. Let me try to get the scope of this particular controller. Scope of this particular element. And as we are familiar with angular.element $0, which is nothing but your currently selected element dot, try to get the scope out of it. Okay, there exists still scope. So even though I am not referring any scope here, there is some kind of scope working behind the scenes. And let us see what is that particular scope. Let us open that. And if you open that, you can see actually this is the O which is assigned as a property to your controller. You can see you have the controller here. So let me go back to my code. You have the controller and you are referring that particular controller related instance as O. And this O is actually added as a parameter to the scope. Not the parameter, as a member to the scope, as a property to the scope. And that particular property O will have these two properties called name and salary. So if you further drill down O, you can see you have name and salary. So you can see even though you are mentioning as O, you are actually working with scope object behind the scenes. It is just nothing but a different syntax. So whether or not you are working with $scope in your project, just like I did in 02, so whether you use $scope or not, or whether you use directly as O and use O itself, you are still working with $scope behind the scenes. But this is a pretty easier way without really referring to the scope, and this is my favorite, especially without really working on $scope. This seems to me more explicit for me, as because I specify my own kind of an instance, and it is easier for me from which instance I really would like to pull all the members. And not every example on the web really will be following this kind of coding, but instead most of the examples you are going to find either in this way or this way. That is, you are going to have EMP with $scope and $scope here. So in either way you can use this or you can use this. So you should be fine working with any of these two. So even though you are working in this controller as fashion, it really works with the scope behind the scenes, and whatever the members you are going to add will be directly added as the members to this particular object called O, which essentially O itself is a member of the $scope. So either way, whether you use this kind of syntax or this kind of syntax is just your wish. The output is same behind the scenes, and at the same time behind the scenes the implementation is also same. So it works out in the same fashion whether you use $scope or just using controller as syntax. And there is one hybrid syntax what certain members will be following. So let me copy this whole thing, and that is, let me put this one into 04. So most of the other developers might also be following this kind of syntax. So this is a hybrid approach. So I can just say something like now $scope dot o equal to this. So I can also use this kind of syntax. So which means what I'm saying now is I'm still working with controller as wo, and you can see I'm still using wo. And whenever you are saying that, you are exclusively saying that you are using $scope and this wo needs to be a member of this, and you start working with this. So this is a hybrid approach. So you have three approaches. One is just using controller as a wo or something else. The second one is using $scope everywhere. The third one is the hybrid version, which means you are using $scope and also controller as. So in future, once your developers are familiar with the controller as option, all you can do is just remove this scope and just remove this scope, and you can just remove this altogether. So that becomes controller as related syntax. So you can use either this way or any of the other two. So let us see if this is working. So I go to $4.html and see if that is working fine. Okay, I have some problem here. Let me double check. So I'm missing some bracket here somewhere. So where is that? So I'm using $scope dot o equal to this. So let me see where and how I'm missing it. So let me double click it, and it is 13th line. Okay, so here it is. So in the 13th line, I actually need to have the square bracket to be placed here. So that was the mistake. So let me refresh this, and now you can see I still have that working. So you can see I have three ways to actually work with scope. So all those three ways I am actually putting in the form of presentation here. So that is, first, with just $scope everywhere. I use $scope with no as. There is no as wo here. There is no controller as wo. I'm not using wo here. The second one is no scope anywhere here, but using as wo with just representing o dot members. So you can see there is no $scope anywhere here. So I personally prefer either this way or this way. So at the same time, I'm more passionate towards this one, but it is up to you. Either you can use this or this. But at the same time, you will also see some examples which go in this direction, which is nothing but you are going to use both $scope and also as wo, which is nothing but a hybrid syntax. So you can use any of these three methods to really have scope to be working.